Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time we're heading to a place I've been dreaming of visiting for ages. Longdong Bay in Taiwan.
Ooh, nice choice. I can see why you'd be drawn to this spot.
Yeah, I mean, you sent over this snorkeling guide, and the pictures alone are just incredible.
It really is a visual feast, isn't it?
Totally. Crystal clear water, dramatic rocky cliffs, sandy beaches. It looks like something out of a movie.
And that's just above the surface.
Right. And then you get under the water and it's a whole other world. Coral reefs, seaweed forests, sea turtles. I mean, come on.
Yeah, the guide really paints a picture of a thriving underwater ecosystem.
It does. Okay, so I'm already hooked on the visuals, but let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Where exactly is Longdong Bay?
So it's on the northeast coast of Taiwan in the Konglio district of New Taipei City, right on the edge of the Pacific Ocean.
Okay, Pacific Ocean. So we're talking big waves, strong currents.
Well, not always, but the currents can definitely be a factor, especially during the northeast monsoon season.
Got it, so something to be aware of. And the guide mentions the terrain being pretty unique too, right?
Yeah, it's known for its rocky coastline and underwater rock formations, which create these amazing habitats for marine life.
I can imagine. But those rocks also mean we need to be careful, especially when we're snorkeling.
Exactly. It's not just a leisurely swim in a pool. You got to be aware of your surroundings.
So no blindly splashing about then.
Not a good idea. And speaking of things to be aware of, we can't forget about the tides.
Okay, now this is where I get really intrigued. I don't think I've ever considered tides when planning a snorkeling trip before.
Oh, they play a huge role. The guide explains how high tide submerges a lot of the rocks, creating a wider snorkeling area, so you have more space to explore.
That makes sense. More water, more space to swim around. What about low tide?
Well, low tide exposes more of the reefs and all those fascinating intertidal creatures.
So it's like two completely different experiences depending on the tide.
It is. High tide for exploration, low tide for those up-close encounters with the smaller marine life.
I'm loving this already. Okay, so we've got the terrain, the currents, the tides. What about weather? Surely that plays a role too, right?
Big time. Visibility is key when you're snorkeling. You want those sunny, clear days for the best underwater views.
Yeah, who wants to be peering through murky water? Not me.
And calm weather is always a plus when you're out in the open ocean.
Makes sense. No one wants to be battling choppy waves while trying to enjoy the underwater scenery.
Right. So yeah, weather is definitely a factor to consider.
Got it. Okay, so let's say we've got the perfect weather, the ideal tide. How do we even choose the right spot to enter the bay?
That's where your swimming ability comes in. Longdong Bay has a variety of entry points, each with its own characteristics.
Okay, so some spots might be better for beginners, while others are more suited for experienced snorkelers.
Exactly. The guide emphasizes choosing a location that aligns with your skill level.
And prioritizing safe zones with weaker currents and high visibility, right?
Absolutely. Those dense reef areas and strong current zones are best left to the more experienced folks.
And just to reiterate, no solo snorkeling adventures, right? Buddy system all the way.
Always. Always let someone know your plans and location before heading out.
Safety first. Speaking of which, let's talk gear. What are the must-haves for exploring Longdong Bay?
Well, you've got your basics. A good mask, snorkel, and fins. A life vest is crucial, especially if you're not a strong swimmer.
And what about a wetsuit?
A wetsuit might be a good idea depending on the water temperature.
Makes sense. You don't want to be shivering your way through the bay.
Right. But having the gear is only half the battle. You need to make sure it's all in good working order, too.
Oh, tell me about it. There's nothing worse than a leaky mask ruining your underwater view.
I can only imagine. And of course, basic safety knowledge is paramount.
Totally. We need to be aware of the water depth, those currents we discussed, and have some basic first aid knowledge, just in case.
You got it. And don't forget emergency equipment like a whistle and a flotation device.
Preparedness is key, especially when you're dealing with the unpredictable nature of the ocean.
Exactly. Speaking of unpredictable, remember those weather factors we mentioned? Let's dig a little deeper into how they can impact our snorkeling trip.
Yeah, because even with the best planning, Mother Nature always has the final say. Wind is a big one, right?
Oh yeah, strong winds bring high waves and those stronger currents we talked about, which can definitely impact safety.
Got it. So wind can make things a bit dicey. What about rain? Does that ruin the whole snorkeling experience?
It can definitely impact visibility, which kind of defeats the purpose of being underwater, right?
True. So sunshine is our best friend.
For clarity, yes. But don't forget the sunscreen.
Of course. Safety first, even when it comes to sunshine.
Hmm.
And those high waves we talked about, those are mainly a concern near the shore, right?
Yeah, they can pose a risk, especially for those entering and exiting the water.
Okay, so wind, rain, sunshine, wave height. It's a lot to keep in mind.
It is, but hey, that's part of the adventure, right?
True. It wouldn't be much of a deep dive if it were too easy. But what about something a bit more unexpected? Like those rip currents the guide mentions. They sound kind of scary.
They can be dangerous, for sure, but the guide does a great job outlining how to identify and deal with them.
Okay, well, that's reassuring. So how do we even spot these rip currents? Are there any telltale signs?
So imagine you're looking out at the ocean. Rip currents often appear as these calmer patches of water amidst breaking waves.
Oh, wow, that's tricky. It's like they're disguised as a safe haven.
Exactly. It can be deceiving. They might even look tempting to a swimmer seeking a break from the waves.
So we need to be extra vigilant. Are there any other visual cues we should be aware of?
You might also notice a difference in the water color. Rip currents can sometimes appear darker or murkier.
Because they're carrying sediment and debris out to sea.
You got it. Think of it as this darker streak cutting through the clearer water.
Okay, a break in the waves, a darker water color. Anything else?
Keep an eye out for a line of foam, seaweed, or debris moving steadily away from the shore.
Got it. So if we see any of those signs, it's a red flag, right?
Exactly.
Okay, but what if we're already in the water? How would a rip current feel different from regular waves?
You might feel a strong pull away from the shore, even if you're a strong swimmer.
Yikes. It's like the ocean is suddenly trying to whisk you away.
It can feel that way, even if you're not very far from the beach.
Okay, that's definitely something I want to avoid. So let's say the worst happens and we find ourselves caught in one of these rip currents. What's the most important thing to remember?
Stay calm. Don't panic.
Easier said than done when you're being pulled out to sea.
I know, but panicking will only lead to exhaustion and poor decision-making. And that can make a dangerous situation even worse.
Right, so clear thinking is crucial. So what should we do instead of panicking and trying to swim against the current?
The key is to swim parallel to the shore, not directly against the current.
Okay, so swim sideways.
Exactly. Rip currents are usually pretty narrow, so swimming sideways will eventually take you out of the current's pull.
It's like escaping a river by swimming towards the riverbank.
You got it.
Okay, swim sideways. But what if we can't manage to swim out of the current right away?
Then float or tread water to conserve energy.
So just go with the flow for a bit?
Yep. Let the current carry you for a bit while you catch your breath and assess the situation.
Okay, float or tread water.
Yeah.
Got it. But how do we eventually get back to shore? Are we just at the mercy of the current?
Not necessarily. Once the current weakens, you can start swimming back to shore at an angle, aiming for a spot where the waves are breaking.
Oh, so we can use the waves to help push us back towards the beach.
Exactly.
Okay, ride the waves back to safety.
Yeah.
That sounds a lot better than being swept out to sea. But what if we're too exhausted to swim, or we're really struggling to stay afloat? How do we effectively call for help?
If you have a whistle, use it. That high-pitched sound will carry farther than your voice.
And if we don't have a whistle?
Wave your arms and shout for help. And this is where that buddy system we talked about comes in handy.
Right. They can swim for help or alert the lifeguards.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got our action plan. Stay calm, swim sideways, float or tread water, signal for help, and ride the waves back to shore.
You got it.
It's amazing how much there is to learn about staying safe in the water, even when you're just snorkeling.
It's always good to be prepared, right?
Absolutely. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here, from understanding the tides to navigating those tricky rip currents.
We have, but our exploration of Longdong Bay is far from over. We've still got those coral reefs, seaweed forests, and maybe even some sea turtles waiting for us.
I can't wait. And we can't forget about those fascinating intertidal creatures we mentioned earlier.
Oh, yeah, those are just waiting to be discovered at low tide.
I'm already picturing those little tide pools teeming with life.
They're quite a sight to behold.
Well, I think we'll have to save that adventure for our next segment.
Sounds like a plan.
I can't wait.
Welcome back to our Longdong Bay adventure. Before we head out to explore those tide pools, I thought it would be fascinating to take a closer look at how the tides really influence life in this incredible ecosystem.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We've talked about how the tides can impact our snorkeling experience, but I'm really curious about the marine life itself. What kind of adaptations do they have to survive these constantly changing conditions?
Well, it's like they have their own internal clocks, perfectly in sync with the rhythm of the tides. The guide gives some really interesting examples, like barnacles.
Barnacles, you mean those little guys that cling to rocks?
Yeah, they're like the ultimate survivors. Think about it. They're exposed to the air for hours at low tide, baking under the sun, and then submerged in water when the tide comes back in.
Wow, that's a pretty harsh environment to live in.
It is. But barnacles have this incredible ability to seal themselves shut during low tide.
Like they're creating their own little waterproof shelters.
Exactly. It helps them conserve moisture and protect themselves from drying out.
That's amazing. It's like they've evolved this perfect strategy to cope with the tides. But what about those creatures that can't just hunker down and wait for the water to return?
While some species have developed a different tactic, migration. Take estuary species, for example. They live in that brackish water where rivers meet the sea.
Oh yeah, that mix of fresh and salt water.
Right. And these creatures have evolved to move with the tides, following food sources and finding suitable breeding grounds.
They're constantly on the move, riding those tidal currents.
It's a pretty remarkable adaptation. It's like they're part of this intricate dance between freshwater and saltwater.
It's amazing how these natural rhythms shape their entire lives.
Right.
But what about the creatures that live in the deep sea? Do they even notice the tides?
Not really. The guide mentions that deep-sea organisms live in a much more stable environment. The pressure is immense, temperatures are frigid, and there's no sunlight.
So the tides don't really affect them the way they do those closer to the surface.
Exactly. It's like they exist in a different world, a world that's less influenced by the constant ebb and flow.
That's fascinating. But let's get back to those tidal influences closer to shore. We talked about breeding earlier. Can you elaborate on how the tides actually play a role in the reproductive cycles of marine life?
Oh, absolutely. The guide highlights how certain species of fish actually time their spawning events to coincide with the incoming tides.
So they use the tides to their advantage.
Exactly. It's a clever way to ensure that their eggs are dispersed far and wide, which increases the chances of survival for their offspring.
Wow, that's incredible. So they're basically hitching a ride on the tides. And what about feeding behavior? How do the tides impact that?
Well, as the tide rises, it brings a whole buffet of nutrients closer to shore, attracting all sorts of hungry creatures.
Like a tidal feast.
Exactly. Filter feeders like oysters and clams take advantage of the increased food particles in the water, while predators like crabs and fish come in for their share of the action.
It's like this perfectly choreographed feeding frenzy, all triggered by the tides.
It is. And then when the tide recedes, a whole other set of feeding opportunities emerges.
Oh, right. Because low tide exposes all those tasty treats on the beach.
You got it. Think worms, snails, small crustaceans, all sorts of delicious morsels for shorebirds and scavengers.
It's amazing to think about how interconnected everything is in this ecosystem and how dependent they all are on these natural rhythms.
It really is a delicate balance, and the guide also points out how human activities can disrupt these rhythms with potentially devastating consequences.
Right, because it's not just about marveling at the beauty of this underwater world, but also acknowledging our role in protecting it.
Absolutely. And in our next segment, we'll explore what responsible snorkeling looks like in action and how we can minimize our impact on this fragile environment.
That sounds like a great plan. But first, I'm still eager to hear more about those intertidal creatures waiting for us at low tide. Let's shift gears and delve into that fascinating world between the tides. And we're back for the final part of our Longdong Bay deep dive. We've covered so much ground already, from understanding the tides to navigating those tricky rip currents, and even explored how marine life adapts to this ever-changing environment.
It's been quite a journey, but before we wrap up, I think it's crucial to talk about responsible snorkeling and how we can minimize our impact on this incredible ecosystem.
Absolutely. We touched on the negative effects of pollution and human activities, but what are some practical steps we can take as individuals to be more responsible snorkelers?
Well, the first thing to remember is that we're guests in this underwater world.
Right, we're not there to conquer or disrupt, but to observe and appreciate.
Exactly. And that means respecting the marine life and avoiding any actions that could cause harm. The guide really emphasizes the importance of not touching or stepping on coral reefs.
Oh, yeah, those are so delicate. I remember reading that even the slightest contact can damage those fragile organisms.
It's true. So look, but don't touch is definitely a good rule of thumb.
Makes sense. But what about all the stuff we bring with us, like sunscreen, water bottles, snacks, that could easily end up as trash in the ocean?
You're right. Minimizing our waste is crucial. Choose reef-safe sunscreen that doesn't contain those harmful chemicals that can damage coral.
Oh, that's a good tip. I didn't even know reef-safe sunscreen was a thing.
Oh yeah, it's becoming more and more common. And always bring a reusable water bottle and pack your snacks in reusable containers to avoid single-use plastics.
Leave no trace behind. That should be every adventurer's motto.
I agree. But responsible snorkeling goes beyond just minimizing our physical impact. It's also about being mindful of our behavior in the water.
So how we interact with the marine life.
Exactly. Maintain a safe distance from the animals. Don't chase them or try to touch them.
Because that can stress them out.
Yeah, it can disrupt their natural behaviors. Remember, we're observers, not intruders.
Observe and appreciate. But what if we do have a close encounter? Like a sea turtle swims right up to us. What's the best way to react?
Just stay calm and move slowly. Avoid sudden movements that might startle the animal.
So just let the creature dictate the interaction.
Exactly. If it approaches you, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
But if it swims away, respect its space.
It's all about being respectful guests in their world. And speaking of respect, the guide also mentions the importance of supporting marine conservation efforts. What are some ways we can get involved beyond just being responsible snorkelers?
Well, there are so many great organizations out there dedicated to marine conservation. We can support them through donations or volunteering our time
Or even just spreading awareness, right?
Absolutely. The more people who understand the importance of protecting our oceans, the better.
So true. Well, I think this deep dive into Longdong Bay has been a real eye-opener, not just about a beautiful snorkeling destination, but about understanding our role in protecting this incredible ecosystem.
It's been amazing to explore these topics with you. Longdong Bay really highlights the interconnectedness of life and the importance of responsible exploration.
It does. And as we wrap up this episode, I want to remind everyone that when you enter that water, you're stepping into a vibrant ecosystem teeming with life. Be curious, be respectful, and be a responsible steward of this incredible underwater world. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.